The man pictured on the screen was my cousin Sean. Now, Sean was more than just a cousin to me. He was someone I considered an older brother, a mentor, and he left a significant impact on my family. But Sean was a drug addict and alcoholic, and for this reason, he was in a sense disowned by his family. He was kicked out of his house at a very young age. He wasn't invited to any family events, and for this reason, this had a negative impact on his life. Over the next few years, Sean's use of drugs and alcohol increased significantly. And within a few years of being kicked out of his house, he was arrested for possession of drugs, and this made his state even worse. After 6 months in prison, he was finally released, but he was not the same. In fact, so unsurprisingly, his use of drugs and alcohol shot up even higher. And within a few months, Sean was out partying with his friends at a bar, mixing drugs and alcohol, and that night, him and his friends stole a car. They took that car out for a joyride and went over county lines, increasing the punishment. Sean was finally arrested, on top of driving under the influence, grand theft auto. He had crossed county borders and was going to be put in prison for a minimum of a year. Now, my uncle had connections in the justice system and managed to narrow it down to just 8 months. But when Sean came out, he was in need of help. This is where my family stepped in. My mom had a soft spot for Sean, so she took him into our family. For the next year, Sean lived with my family and attempted to recover, but he couldn't follow house rules. Now, these weren't drug-related or alcohol-related rules, but just simply curfew and things of that sort. So my mom was forced to kick him out. This was very hard on Sean, and as always, Sean returned to his drug and alcohol use. Another night, Sean went out partying with his friends and returned home safely from the bar. The next morning, no one could get hold of him. That prompted my other cousin Brian, and Brian was Sean's brother, to go check on Sean. And that morning, Brian found that Sean had overdosed on Oxycontin that previous night. Now, this took a detrimental effect on my family, increasing drug and alcohol use in my own family. And this is why I'm here to talk to you guys about it today. Why the United States and society should treat drug addiction as a mental health issue rather than a crime. To begin, punishing and criminalizing drug addicts rather than focusing on rehabilitation is ineffective. According to the National Association of Drug Court, 95% of incarcerated drug addicts return to abuse after release from prison. Now, the fact that 95% of drug abusers are returning to use after prison just highlights that putting them in prison is simply ineffective if they're just going to return to drug addiction right after they're released. Additionally, it shows that the United States is treating it as a crime rather than a rehabilitative measure, and in fact, it's intensifying the issue, and in return, creating an endless cycle of abuse and imprisonment. Additionally, according to Drug Facts, nationwide trends, 60 to 80% of drug abusers commit a new crime, typically a drug-driven crime. This was evident with my cousin Sean. After release from prison, Sean's drug use not only increased, but he was driven to commit another crime. Now, the fact that drug abusers are more inclined to commit another crime in addition to their drug addiction is, again, just intensifying the issue at hand rather than addressing it. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime estimates that the United States spends $3.6 billion annually to incarcerate drug abusers alone. Now, based on the previous two statistics, drug addicts are not only more inclined to increase their addiction, they're more inclined to commit another crime. So the United States spending billions of dollars to incarcerate these people is simply counterproductive. Of course, as you can see on the chart above me, it is in fact cheaper to focus on rehabilitative measures rather than imprisonment. So if the United States took the billions of dollars and put it towards rehabilitative measures, they would actually see real progress rather than intensifying and worsening the issue at hand. But rehabilitation leads me into the solution. This is my next claim, that countries who treat drug addiction as a public health issue rather than a crime see a decrease in crime and drug abuse. This was evident in Portugal. In B. Vastag's 2017 publication, 5 years after, Portugal's drug decriminalization shows positive results. The total number of drug addicts in Portugal decreased by half within the first 3 years of implementation. Portugal took away the stigma of drug addiction and instead decriminalized it and treated it as a public health issue, offering support to the drug addicts rather than incriminating them, and therefore actually saw positive results. A decrease of 50% of drug addicts in our country, which is a significant decrease. Furthermore, in G. Merkin's 2014 publication, he discusses how the number of drug addicts in Portugal's prisons decreased by over 20%. Now, there were still drug addicts in Portugal's prisons, but these were drug addicts who had committed violent crimes, not simply just possession of drugs or being drug addicts themselves. In fact, Portugal saved billions of dollars by focusing on rehabilitative measures rather than imprisonment. And they decided to take the money and put it towards rehab, which is something the United States should follow. In M. Soalis' 2010 publication regarding Portugal's policy, he discusses that the number of drug abusers receiving rehabilitative treatment increased by 41%. Now, by taking the crime out of drug addiction, you're also taking the stigma away associated with drug addiction. Rather than perceiving these people as criminals, you perceive them as people that need help. And by taking away the stigma, the drug addicts themselves feel more inclined to go receive rehabilitative help because there's no longer a stigma or a negative connotation associated with drug addiction. And this saw extremely beneficial effects in Portugal. Now, imagine this in the United States. Oh, going back to this. Portugal in the European Union has one of the lowest drug-related deaths in Europe, and the United States would fall around this area. So by taking away the stigma, they also saw a decrease in the number of drug-related deaths. Now, I want you guys to visualize this in the United States. The United States doesn't necessarily need to decriminalize all drugs because that is going to be essentially impossible with our current legislation. But if the United States were to implement a similar policy to Portugal, there would be a decrease in crime, a decrease in the number of drug addicts, a decrease in the number of drug-related deaths, and the United States would save billions of dollars that they could put towards rehabilitative measures. Now, we as a society need to recognize drug addiction as a mental health issue rather than a crime. See, our current policy depicts them as criminals, which only contributes to the spiral of addiction. Until we get rid of this stigma, we will not see any progress with drug addiction. The United States needs to focus on, rather than criminalizing and escalating the issue, they need to make it a public health issue. The United States has maintained the same policy for years and has yet to see change. In fact, drug rates and drug-related deaths continue to increase every year, which is why the United States needs to change their current policy in order to see improvement. And we need to accept, we as individuals need to accept and offer guidance to drug addicts rather than alienating them. In the example of my family, Sean was alienated from the majority of my family, and as a result, this took a detrimental effect on his life. Increased his drug use, which eventually led to his own death. So until we, as a society in the United States, recognize drug addiction for what it is, a public health issue, we will not see any improvement in the current drug state in the United States. Thank you.